I never imagined that installing a propane tank on my own property would turn into a year-long battle with the most vindictive HOA president I'd ever encountered. But there I was, standing in my driveway in Phoenix, Arizona, watching Deborah Fletcher point her manicured finger at my perfectly legal 500-gallon propane tank, like it had personally insulted her ancestors. My name is Frank Olson, and I'd bought my house in the Saguaro Heights subdivision about 3 years ago. The place was perfect for me, a single guy in his early 40s who worked remotely as a software engineer. I'd gotten a great deal on the property because the previous owner had let it run down a bit, but I'd spent the better part of 2 years fixing it up, getting all the proper permits, and making it into something I was genuinely proud of. The neighborhood was decent enough, mostly professionals and retirees, and the HOA had been relatively quiet until about 6 months ago when Deborah took over as president. The propane tank installation happened in early March 2025. I'd been tired of relying on the inconsistent natural gas service in our area, and after a particularly cold winter where my heat kept cutting out, I decided to switch to propane. I did everything by the book, got my permits from the city, hired a licensed contractor, and made sure the tank met all setback requirements from property lines and structures. The tank was placed on the side of my house, partially screened by the existing desert landscaping, and painted to blend in with my stucco exterior. Everything was fine for exactly 2 weeks. Then came the knock on my door one Saturday morning. I opened it to find Deborah standing there with 2 other women I recognized from the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, wearing what I could only describe as her power suit, despite it being a weekend. "Frank, we need to discuss your unauthorized installation," she said without preamble. I leaned against the doorframe. "What unauthorized installation?" "The propane tank," she said, gesturing toward the side of my house. "You didn't submit an architectural review committee application." I actually laughed. "Deborah, I checked the CC and Articus before I installed it. Utility installations don't require ARC approval as long as they meet city codes, which mine does." Her face tightened. "That may have been the policy under previous leadership, but we've updated our enforcement procedures. You'll need to submit a retroactive application." "Let me get this straight," I said, crossing my arms. "You want me to submit an application for something that's already installed and doesn't require approval, correct?" She made a note on her clipboard. "And there's another matter. Several residents have expressed interest in converting to propane as well. We'd like you to extend your connection to the neighboring properties." That threw me. "Excuse me." One of the women with her, whose name I thought was Patricia, stepped forward. "It only makes sense, Frank. You've already done the work of setting up the infrastructure. Sharing the connection would be more economical for everyone." "That's not how propane works," I said slowly, like I was explaining to a child. "This is my tank, my system. It's not like a pipeline I can just tap into. Each property needs its own tank and its own contract with a propane supplier." Deborah's expression remained stony. "We'll expect your cooperation on this matter. It's about community spirit, Frank, something you'd understand if you attended more HOA meetings." "I attend the meetings," I said. "And I vote, which is how I know that nothing you're describing has been approved by the membership. The board has certain discretionary powers," she said primly. "Not over my private property, you don't." She gave me a thin smile. "We'll see about that. You have until the end of the month to submit your ARC application. There will be a fee." "Of course there will be," I muttered as she walked away. I should have known that wouldn't be the end of it. 3 days later, I received a formal letter from the HOA. The application fee for my retroactive ARC submission was $500. The letter also included a proposal for a shared propane system that would require me to allow installation of distribution lines from my tank to 4 neighboring properties, with the cost of the installation split among the participants, but with me responsible for maintaining the primary tank and connection. I read the proposal 3 times, getting angrier with each pass. They wanted me to pay for the privilege of becoming a utility provider to my neighbors, taking on all the liability and maintenance costs, while they got cheap propane access. It was insane. I called my lawyer, a sharp woman named Margaret Chen, who had used for my real estate closing. She read through the documents I scanned and sent her. "This is absurd," she said over the phone. "They have no legal authority to compel you to share your private utility connection. As for the ARC fee, I'd need to review your C-canned article more carefully, but my initial read is that they can't retroactively apply new requirements to compliant installations. So I just ignore them." Not exactly. Respond in writing. Cite the relevant sections of your C-canned articles that exempt your installation from ARC review, and clearly state that you will not be participating in any shared propane system. Keep everything documented. I followed her advice, sending a certified letter to the HOA board that same week. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The following Saturday, I woke up to find a work crew in my side yard. I pulled on jeans and a shirt and ran outside to find 3 men with surveying equipment setting up near my propane tank. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" I demanded. One of the men, older with a sun-weathered face, looked up from his clipboard. "HOA hired us to survey for the propane distribution system." "There is no propane distribution system. This is private property and you're trespassing." He frowned. "We got a work order from a Deborah Fletcher, paid deposit and everything. I don't care if the Pope paid you. Get off my property now, or I'm calling the police." To their credit, the guys packed up without argument. The older one shook his head as they left. "You should sort this out with your HOA, buddy. This is the 3rd job this month where the residents didn't know we were coming." After they left, I immediately called Deborah. She didn't answer. I left a message making it crystal clear that no one was authorized to enter my property for any reason related to the propane system. Then I called Margaret again. "They sent contractors onto your property without permission?" She asked, her tone sharp. "Yep, that's trespassing. You might want to file a police report just to have it on record." I did. The officer who took my report was sympathetic, but basically said unless I wanted to press charges against the contractors, who were clearly just doing what they'd been hired to do, there wasn't much they could do. He did note the incident in his report and suggested I consider posting no trespassing signs. The next HOA meeting was 2 weeks away, and I marked it on my calendar with a big red X. I wasn't going to miss this one. In the meantime, I installed security cameras covering my entire property, focusing especially on the area around the propane tank. I also put up clearly visible no trespassing signs and sent another certified letter to the HOA, this time explicitly stating that any unauthorized entry onto my property would result in criminal charges and civil action. The letter I got back was a masterpiece of bureaucratic doublespeak. It essentially said that, as HOA president, Deborah had the authority to inspect any exterior installations for compliance with community standards, and that my refusal to cooperate was creating an adversarial environment that was detrimental to community harmony. The HOA meeting was held in the community center, a bland beige building at the entrance to our subdivision. I arrived early and was surprised to see about 40 people there. Usually, these meetings drew maybe a dozen residents. Deborah sat at the front table with 4 other board members. She looked surprised to see the crowd but recovered quickly, calling the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. The meeting dragged through the usual business, financial reports, landscape maintenance discussions, and pool regulations. Finally, we got to new business. "We need to discuss the Community Propane Initiative," Deborah announced. "As many of you know, the recent utility disruptions have affected several residents. The board is proposing a shared propane system that would provide reliable service to multiple homes." A hand went up. It was Tom, a retired engineer who lived 3 streets over. "What does this have to do with Frank Olson's tank?" Deborah's expression tightened. "Mr. Olson has already installed the infrastructure needed to serve as a hub for the system. We're simply proposing that he share that resource with his neighbors." "That's not what you're proposing," I said, standing up. "You're proposing that I become a utility provider, taking on all the liability and maintenance costs while you benefit. And you've already sent contractors onto my property without permission to survey for this system I never agreed to." Murmurs ran through the crowd. "That's a mischaracterization," Deborah said coldly. "The board was conducting a routine inspection. With surveying equipment, I have it on video." More murmurs, louder this time. Another resident, Helen Narada, stood up. "Deborah, did the board vote on this propane initiative? The board has discretionary authority on community improvement projects." "That's not an answer," Tom said. "Did you vote on it or not?" Deborah shuffled her papers. "The board discussed it in executive session." "Which isn't a vote," I said. "And you don't have the authority to force private property owners to share their utility connections." A thin man I didn't know well raised his hand. "I'm one of the neighbors who was told I could connect to Frank's system. Are you saying that's not happening?" "It was never happening," I said, turning to face him. "My propane system is sized for my house. It's not designed to serve multiple properties, and I'm not interested in taking on that responsibility or liability." "But Deborah said it was all arranged," the man protested. "Deborah doesn't speak for me or my property." The meeting devolved into chaos after that, with multiple residents arguing about what they'd been told versus what was actually authorized. Deborah tried to maintain control, but it was clear she'd overplayed her hand. The meeting ended with a motion, passed by general vote, to table any discussion of a community propane system until a proper proposal could be drafted and reviewed by the membership. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 days after the meeting, I received a notice of violation. According to the HOA, my propane tank was in violation of Section 7.3 of the C-Cand Articles, which governed visual harmony and aesthetic standards. The tank, they claimed, was an eyesore and needed to be removed or relocated at my expense. I read Section 7.3. It was deliberately vague, talking about maintaining community aesthetic standards and preventing installations that materially detract from neighborhood property values. There was no specific mention of propane tanks, utility installations, or any objective standard for what constituted an eyesore. Margaret reviewed it and sighed. "This is a nuisance action. They're hoping you'll just give in to make it go away." The good news is that section also requires the HOA to prove material impact, which is going to be hard when your tank is screened and meets all code requirements. "What do I do?" "Request a hearing, which is your right under the C-Cand Articles. Make them prove their case, and document everything." I requested the hearing. It was scheduled for 3 weeks out, which gave me time to prepare. I took dozens of photos of my tank from every angle, showing how it was screened by landscaping and barely visible from the street. I got written statements from 3 neighbors, including Tom, stating that they had no objection to the tank and didn't consider it an eyesore. I compiled all my permits and the city's approval documentation. The hearing was held on a Wednesday evening. The board sat at a table, and I was given a chair facing them like I was on trial. About 15 residents attended to watch. Deborah opened the proceeding. "Mr. Olson, you're here to address the violation notice regarding your propane tank installation." "I'm here to contest the violation notice," I corrected, "because there is no violation." The board disagrees. "Your installation creates a visual impact that affects property values." "You have any evidence of that?" She produced a printed photograph. "This shows the tank is clearly visible from the street." I looked at the photo. It had been taken from an angle that maximized the tank's visibility, probably from the middle of the street with a telephoto lens. That's not representative of normal viewing angles. "I have photos taken from standard positions that show the tank is well screened." I distributed my photos to the board members. Deborah barely glanced at them. "The tank is still visible," she insisted. "So is every roof, every air conditioning unit, every satellite dish in this neighborhood. Being visible isn't the same as being an eyesore." One of the other board members, a quiet man named George, spoke up. "Do we have any complaints from neighbors about the tank?" "The board received concerns," Deborah said vaguely. "From who?" I asked. "I have written statements from my immediate neighbors saying they have no problem with it. Complaints can be submitted anonymously." "How convenient," I said. "So I'm supposed to defend against accusations from people who won't identify themselves." Tom stood up from the audience. "Deborah, this is ridiculous. Frank's tank looks fine. You're just mad he won't play along with your propane scheme." "This has nothing to do with that," Deborah snapped. "Then what's it about?" Tom challenged. "Because it sure looks like harassment." The hearing went on for another hour, getting increasingly heated. In the end, the board voted 3-2 to uphold the violation, with Deborah, Patricia, and a third member named Stan voting yes. George and the fifth member, a woman named Carol, voted no. I had 30 days to appeal or comply. Margaret helped me file an appeal to the full membership, which triggered another meeting. But before that meeting could happen, things escalated in a way I never expected. I came home from a grocery run on a Saturday afternoon to find my propane tank's main valve had been shut off. My pilot lights were out and my house was getting cold. I checked the valve and found it had been deliberately closed and secured with a padlock. I was furious. I called the propane company first, thinking maybe there was a safety issue they'd responded to. They had no record of any service call to my address. Then I called a locksmith to remove the padlock, which cost me $150 for emergency service. Once I had access back, I checked my security cameras. The footage was clear. Deborah herself had entered my property at 2 in the afternoon and locked the valve. She'd spent maybe 3 minutes on my property total. I called the police immediately. The officer who responded was different from the one who'd taken my first report. This was Officer David Martinez, a no-nonsense guy in his 30s who actually seemed interested in the situation. "Let me see the footage," he said. I showed him on my laptop. The video clearly showed Deborah walking up to the tank, examining it, pulling the padlock from her purse and securing it to the valve. It even caught her face clearly. "That's pretty clear-cut," Martinez said. "That's tampering with your utilities, which is criminal mischief at minimum. Could potentially be more depending on how we charge it." "I want to press charges." "You sure? This is a neighbor situation. Things can get uglier." "They're already ugly. She needs to understand she can't do this." He nodded. "All right, I'll need a copy of that footage and a formal statement." I provided everything he needed. He said he'd be in touch. Deborah was arrested 2 days later. It was the talk of the neighborhood. She was released the same day on her own recognizance, but the damage to her reputation was done. An emergency HOA board meeting was called, and there were serious discussions about removing her as president. Instead of backing down, Deborah doubled down. She sent an email to the entire HOA membership, claiming I had fabricated the video evidence, and that she'd been attempting to perform a safety inspection of an improperly installed tank. She attached a report from what she claimed was a certified propane inspector stating my installation was dangerous. I had the report reviewed by my propane company. They laughed. The inspector wasn't certified in Arizona, and the report was full of technical errors and misstatements. It was clearly a hatchet job. Margaret advised me to file a civil suit for harassment and defamation. She's crossed so many lines here, Frank. You need to protect yourself. I filed suit the next week. The neighborhood was completely divided now. Some people thought I was overreacting and making a mountain out of a molehill. Others were appalled by Deborah's behavior and wanted her removed from the board. The membership meeting to vote on her removal was scheduled for mid-May. In the meantime, I had to deal with the criminal case against her. The prosecutor assigned to the case was a young woman named Amanda Torres, who seemed genuinely angry about what Deborah had done. "Shutting off someone's utilities is serious," she told me when we met to go over my statement. "Especially here in Arizona, where temperature extremes can be life-threatening. We're charging her with criminal mischief and unlawful interference with utilities. What's the likely outcome? If she pleads guilty, probably probation and a fine. If she fights it and loses at trial, could be jail time, though probably not much. The bigger impact will be the conviction on her record." Deborah pleaded not guilty and hired an expensive lawyer from Scottsdale. Her defense was that, as HOA president, she had authority to inspect and, if necessary, secure dangerous installations on community property. There was just one problem with that defense. My property wasn't community property, and she had no expertise or authority to determine what was or wasn't dangerous. While waiting for the trial date, the HOA membership meeting happened. I'd never seen the community center so packed. Every seat was filled and people were standing along the walls. Deborah stood at the front, flanked by her lawyer. "I want to address the false allegations that have been made against me," she began. "They're not false," someone shouted from the back. "I was performing my duties as HOA president, ensuring community safety." Mr. Olson's installation was flagged as potentially dangerous, and I took appropriate action. Tom stood up. "You locked his propane tank with a padlock you brought from home. That's not a safety inspection, that's sabotage." I secured a dangerous installation until it could be properly evaluated. "By who?" Helen asked. "You're not a propane inspector. You have no qualifications to determine what's safe." I relied on expert guidance from the fake inspector whose report was debunked by an actual propane company. I said, standing up, "The one who's not even certified in Arizona." Deborah's face flushed red. "This is character assassination." "No," I said. "This is you facing consequences for your actions. You've harassed me for months because I wouldn't go along with your scheme to make me a utility provider for the neighborhood. When that didn't work, you tried to force me to remove my tank. When that didn't work, you committed a crime. You shut off my utilities and damaged my property. And now you're facing criminal charges for it." The room erupted in arguments. Deborah's supporters claimed I was being vindictive. My supporters pointed out that she'd brought this on herself. When order was finally restored, the vote was called. Out of 123 eligible households, 97 were present or had submitted proxies. The vote to remove Deborah as president was 71 to 26. She was out. George was appointed interim president, and the board immediately voted to rescind all actions related to my propane tank and the proposed shared system. I was even refunded the application fee I'd been forced to pay. But Deborah wasn't done. A week after her removal, I came home to find graffiti sprayed on my propane tank. Someone had written "selfish" and "greedy" in large red letters. My security cameras caught it, but the person had worn dark clothes and a ski mask. I couldn't identify them. I repainted the tank, costing me several hundred more dollars. I also upgraded my security system and added motion-activated floodlights around the tank area. 3 days later, someone tried again. This time, my security system worked perfectly. The floodlights came on, the alarm sounded, and the person ran. I got clear footage of them fleeing, and while I couldn't identify them, I could see they were about Deborah's height and build, wearing the same dark clothes. I reported it to the police and gave them the footage. Officer Martinez came out personally. "I can't prove it's her from this," he said, reviewing the video. "But between you and me, I'd bet money on it. What can I do? Keep documenting everything. We're building a pattern here." The criminal trial for the utility tampering was set for late June. In the weeks leading up to it, I tried to just live my life and ignore the ongoing drama. Some neighbors were supportive, bringing me cookies or stopping by to chat. Others avoided me like I had the plague. Patricia, one of Deborah's allies, confronted me at the mailboxes one afternoon. "Are you happy now? You've destroyed her life over nothing." "She destroyed her own life by breaking the law," I said calmly. "I just wanted to be left alone. You could have shared the propane connection. You could have been a good neighbor." "I am a good neighbor. What I'm not is a doormat." She didn't ask me to share. She demanded it, then harassed me when I refused, then committed a crime. Those were her choices, not mine. Patricia huffed off, but her words stuck with me. Was I being unreasonable? Should I have just gone along to keep the peace? I talked to Margaret about it. "You're second-guessing yourself," she observed. "Stop it. You had every right to refuse. Your property, your utilities, your choice. What she did afterward was all on her." The trial lasted 2 days. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They had video of Deborah entering my property, tampering with my utilities, and the testimony of the locksmith who'd removed the padlock. They had my testimony about the impact, including having no heat or hot water until I could get the locksmith out there. Deborah's defense tried to argue that she'd had good faith belief she was acting within her authority. The prosecutor shredded that argument. She presented the C-canned artifice, which gave the HOA no such authority. She presented testimony from the propane company about the fake inspector's report. She even got George to testify that the board had never authorized Deborah to take such action. The jury was out for less than 3 hours. Guilty on both counts. Sentencing was set for 2 weeks later. In the meantime, I had another problem. The HOA's insurance company was refusing to cover Deborah's actions in my civil suit, claiming she'd acted outside the scope of her duties. That meant if I won, I'd have to collect from Deborah personally. Margaret filed a motion to add the HOA as a defendant, arguing they'd failed to properly supervise Deborah and had created an environment where she felt empowered to act as she had. It was a long shot, but we had to try. At sentencing, the judge was not sympathetic to Deborah. "Mrs. Fletcher, you held a position of trust in your community. Instead of using that position responsibly, you engaged in a pattern of harassment and ultimately criminal behavior against a homeowner who was simply exercising his legal rights. This court take such abuse of authority very seriously. She sentenced Deborah to 1 year of probation, 200 hours of community service, a $5,000 fine, and restitution for all my documented costs, which totaled about $3,000 between the locksmith, repainting, security system upgrades, and legal fees for the criminal case. Deborah's face was stone as the sentence was read. She didn't look at me once. The civil case was settled a month later. The HOA's insurance did eventually agree to cover part of the damages, and Deborah's homeowner's insurance covered the rest. I received $40,000 in total, covering my legal fees, documented damages, and compensation for the harassment and emotional distress. It was over. Finally. But the story doesn't quite end there. With Deborah gone and George running things, the HOA actually became functional. George reached out to me personally to apologize for everything that had happened and to assure me there would be no more problems. I should have stood up to her sooner, he admitted over coffee at a local shop. I knew she was out of line, but I didn't want the conflict. I get it, I said. But doing nothing is still a choice. Lesson learned. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal. The drama faded, people stopped talking about it, and life went on. A couple of other homeowners did end up installing their own propane systems, following my example and doing it the right way, with proper permits and their own tanks. Deborah and her husband quietly listed their house in September and moved out by November. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that they'd relocated somewhere in California. I didn't ask for details and didn't care. The civil settlement money went into my savings, except for a portion I spent on completing some home improvements I'd been putting off. I built a nice deck in the back, upgraded my landscaping, and turned one of my spare bedrooms into a proper home office. In December, almost a year after the whole saga began, Tom invited me to a neighborhood Christmas party. I almost didn't go. After everything that had happened, I wasn't sure I'd be welcome. But Tom insisted. The party was at his house, a big rambling place with a huge backyard. About 30 neighbors showed up, and to my surprise, most were friendly. A few people even apologized for not supporting me more actively during the conflict. Helen came up to me with a glass of wine in hand. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "For what?" "For standing up to her. Deborah had been pushing people around for months before the propane thing. Little power plays, threatening violation notices over petty stuff. You were the first person to really fight back, and it showed everyone else they didn't have to take it. I just didn't want to be pushed around on my own property." Exactly, and that mattered. As the evening went on and I talked with more neighbors, I realized that Deborah's behavior had affected more people than I'd known. Several homeowners shared stories of unreasonable demands, threatened violations, and general bullying tactics. My fight with her had apparently been the catalyst for a broader reckoning in the community. George gave a short speech toward the end of the night, thanking everyone for their patience during the transition, and promising a more collaborative approach to HOA governance going forward. "We're neighbors first," he said. "Not just residents under an HOA regime. Let's remember that." People applauded, and someone started singing Christmas carols, and the party shifted into a more relaxed celebration. As I drove home that night, past the rows of houses with their Christmas lights and decorations, I reflected on the whole experience. It had been exhausting, expensive, and stressful. There were days I'd regretted ever installing that propane tank, but I'd learned some important lessons. Standing up for yourself matters. Documentation matters. Knowing your rights matters. And sometimes, refusing to be pushed around is the most neighborly thing you can do, because bullies only stop when people stop giving in. My propane tank still sits on the side of my house, painted to match the stucco, partially hidden by desert landscaping. It works perfectly, keeping my house heated in winter and running my gas appliances year-round. Every time I look at it, I remember what it cost me to keep it, and I'm reminded that some things are worth fighting for. The HOA is under new management now, with board members who actually read the sea-canned articles and understand that their job is to maintain the community, not to rule over it like petty tyrants. We have regular meetings where real issues get discussed and voted on democratically. It's boring and bureaucratic and exactly what an HOA should be. I still work from home, still enjoy my house, and still appreciate the quiet neighborhood I chose to live in. The drama is in the past, a story I sometimes tell when people ask why I have security cameras covering every angle of my property. And if anyone ever asks if they should fight back against an unreasonable HOA, I tell them yes. Document everything, know your rights, get good legal advice, and don't back down just because it's easier. Because your home is your castle, even if it's in an HOA subdivision in Phoenix, Arizona. The propane tank that started it all keeps working, day after day, requiring only routine maintenance and the occasional refill. It cost me more than I ever imagined to keep it, but not in the ways I expected. The financial cost was significant but recoverable. The time and stress were harder to measure. But the principle, the simple right to make decisions about my own property without harassment or interference, that was priceless. In the end, I'd won. Not just in court, not just in the settlement, but in a more fundamental way. I'd refused to let someone else dictate how I lived in my own home, and I'd prevailed. Deborah had tried to force me into compliance through intimidation, bureaucratic maneuvering, and ultimately criminal action, and every step of the way, she'd failed. The following spring, I planted more desert landscaping around the tank area, adding some beautiful barrel cactus and prickly pear that would grow over time and provide even better screening. It was my property, my choice, and I was going to enjoy it on my terms. I ran into Patricia one final time, several months after everything was settled. We were both at the local grocery store, and she spotted me in the produce section. For a moment, I thought she might just walk away, but instead she came over. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. I was so surprised I nearly dropped the avocado I was examining. Okay. I was wrong about the whole propane situation. Deborah convinced me and a few others that you were being selfish, that you should share the connection, that it was the community-minded thing to do. But after everything came out in the trial, after hearing what actually happened from multiple people, I realized she'd been manipulating all of us. I appreciate you saying that. She told me and some others that the board had voted to require you to share the connection, that it was already decided and you were just being difficult. That's why I was so hostile. I thought you were fighting against a legitimate HOA decision. There was never a vote, I said. It was all her, trying to force something that made no sense. Patricia nodded. I know that now. I'm sorry I didn't look into it more carefully myself. I just trusted that the HOA president wouldn't lie about something like that. Lesson learned for both of us, I guess. We chatted for a few more minutes, and while we didn't become friends, at least the hostility was gone. It was another small step toward the neighborhood returning to normal. Life continued. Work projects came and went. I dated a woman named Sarah for a few months, though it didn't work out. I took up hiking in the nearby Sonoran Desert and discovered a new appreciation for the landscape that surrounded my home. The propane tank just kept doing its job, which is all I'd ever wanted from it in the first place. By the time a full year had passed since Deborah's sentencing, The whole saga had become just another piece of neighborhood history. New residents moved in who'd never heard the story. The homes where Deborah's supporters had lived slowly turned over, new families arriving with no stake in old conflicts. The HOA board functioned smoothly under George's leadership and later under Carol's, when George stepped down after 2 years. I even served on a committee for a while, helping to review and update some of the outdated C-canned articles to make them clearer and less open to interpretation. We added specific language about utility installations, defining them clearly and exempting them from ARC review as long as they met all local codes and permit requirements. It felt good to turn the negative experience into something constructive. I'm still in that house today. Still working remotely, still enjoying my quiet life in Saguaro Heights. The propane tank is still there too, now almost completely hidden by the mature desert plants around it. It's been reliable, efficient, and exactly what I needed. Sometimes people ask if I regret the fight, if I wish I'd just moved instead of dealing with all the drama. The answer is always no. This is my home. I chose it, invested in it, improved it. Nobody had the right to force me to surrender control of my own property, or to share my private utilities with others against my will. Standing up to Deborah wasn't about being stubborn or difficult. It was about maintaining a principle that matters. Your home is yours, and within the bounds of law and reason, you get to make the choices about how you live in it. The HOA has rules, and rules serve a purpose. They protect property values, maintain community standards, and ensure that one person's choices don't negatively impact everyone else. But rules have limits, and those limits matter. When an HOA or its leadership exceeds their authority, when they try to control aspects of homeowners' lives that are beyond their legitimate scope, pushing back isn't just a right but a responsibility. Because if I'd given in, if I'd let Deborah force me into her propane sharing scheme or intimidate me into removing a legal installation, what would she have done next? Who else would she have targeted? Sometimes standing your ground isn't just about protecting yourself, but about setting a precedent that protects everyone. The security cameras are still up, though they rarely capture anything more interesting than the occasional coyote passing through at night. The no trespassing signs are still posted, though they've faded in the intense Arizona sun, and I'll need to replace them soon. These precautions remain, not because I expect trouble, but because the experience taught me the value of documentation and deterrence. I keep all the legal documents in a file in my home office. The certified letters, the court records, the settlement agreement. Not because I expect to need them again, but because they represent something important. They're evidence that the system, for all its flaws and frustrations, can work. That individuals can stand up to organizations and prevail when they are in the right. Sometimes, late at night when I'm working and the house is quiet, I'll look out the window toward where the propane tank sits in the darkness and think about everything it represented. Such a simple thing, a tank of compressed gas to heat my home and fuel my appliances. Yet it became the focal point of a battle over property rights, personal autonomy, and the limits of HOA authority. If I could go back and do it differently, would I? Maybe I would have been more diplomatic in those early conversations with Deborah. Maybe I would have tried harder to explain why her propane sharing scheme was impractical before flatly refusing. But ultimately, the outcome would have been the same. She wasn't interested in compromise or understanding. She wanted compliance, and when she didn't get it, she escalated until she crossed legal and ethical lines. The neighborhood today is peaceful. Children play in the streets on summer evenings. Neighbors wave to each other. The HOA sends out reasonable notices about pool maintenance schedules and landscape standards. It's what suburban life should be, boring and functional and free of drama. And my propane tank keeps working, day after day, year after year. A monument to standing your ground, wrapped in painted metal and surrounded by prickly pear cactus. Every time the heating kicks on during a cold desert night, or I cook on my gas range, I'm reminded that some battles, as exhausting as they are worth fighting. Because in the end, it wasn't really about the propane tank at all. It was about the right to make my own decisions about my own property. The right to say no without being harassed or threatened. The right to exist in my own home on my own terms, within the bounds of law and regulation, but beyond the petty tyranny of an overreaching HOA president. Those rights matter. They're worth defending. And while I hope I never have to fight such a battle again, if I do, at least I'll know how. I'll know to document everything, to stand firm on principle, to seek good legal advice, and to never back down just because fighting is uncomfortable. My home is my castle, propane tank and all, and that's exactly how it should be.